All right, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Rachel Wesson. I am the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. In partnership with our friends at Cyversity, we are so glad to have you all join us for today's discussion, When the Internet Surrounds Us, Inclusive Strategies to Enhance Privacy and Security in Smart Homes and Neighborhoods, featuring this expert panel of researchers who are at the forefront of thinking about the privacy, security, and surveillance challenges that people are facing in their homes and neighborhoods with the proliferation of smart home devices, which we now call the Internet of Things. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Richmond Wong. Richmond is a postdoctoral fellow at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. His research focuses on how technology professionals attend to and address ethical issues in their work. His research also aims to develop design-centered methods and approaches to proactively surface ethical issues related to technology, particularly those surrounding social values such as privacy and security. So with that, Richmond, over to you.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction and welcome, Rachel. I'm really excited to start this conversation today about strategies to enhance privacy and security in smart homes and neighborhoods. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that we're hosting this at UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huchuan, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. So, new devices that are coming out like smart cameras, smart speakers, video doorbells are part of an Internet of Things, which is becoming more pervasive in everyday life. And while these might provide benefits for things like saving time and energy or accessibility or managing home tasks, they also present challenges for security, privacy, and surveillance in homes and neighborhoods. And so this panel builds on conversations that this group has had at the Computer Supported Cooperative Work, or CSCW conference, about these types of privacy issues and how these challenges are not only about kind of data security, but about the diverse humans who interact with these devices and how people from different backgrounds or skill levels or populations might face different types of harms or risks. So I'm very happy to be introducing you all to these four experts working in the space. Diana Freed is a PhD candidate in the Department of Computer and Information Science at Cornell University. Her research interests are in human-computer interaction, usable security and privacy, technology policy, and digital health. Jessica Vitek is an associate professor at the College of Information Studies and director of the Human-Computer Interaction Lab at the University of Maryland. Her research evaluates the privacy and ethical implications of big data, the Internet of Things, and other smart technologies. Yaxing Yao is an assistant professor in the Department of Information Systems at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. His research lies in the intersection of human-computer interaction, usable privacy and security, and the Internet of Things. And Michael Zimmer is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at Marquette University and is an affiliated faculty at the Northwestern Mutual Data Science Institute. His work focuses on digital privacy and surveillance, ethics of big data, internet research ethics, and the broader social and ethical dimensions of emerging digital technologies. So welcome all four of you to CLTC. I'm really glad that you're all able to make the time to come here today. So first, I think I just want to ask you all, what types of harms and risks surface in home IoT environments based on the research you do? And we can start with Diana.
First of all, thank you so much for having me today. So I focus on technology-facilitated abuse in the context of adult and youth interpersonal relationships. And these types of IoT devices are used as tools for partners to often surveil each other in these types of relationships, in these adult relationships. And the devices are used both overtly and covertly. So very often they are in an abusive relationship. An abuser might leave the relationship and still maintain control of the home through these types of devices. And that gives them obviously power over the home environment as well as the individual. And so we see a lot of that type of situation surfacing.
Great, thanks. We'll just kind of run down the group here. So then, Jessica, what kind of things come up in your work?
So I'm going to preface this by saying that the majority of research that I do on this, Michael, is my collaborator. So I'm going first, Michael. So you're going to have to figure out what I'm not talking about. We've been looking at all kinds of smart devices over the last 6 years and how consumers think about whether to buy them, whether to use them, how to use them in their home, and kind of the negotiations they have with other house members. And probably two of the things that come up a lot are around the data sensitivity and how people think about the data that's being generated from these devices, and often think about them in isolation. So something like the number of steps I take in a day. People say, well, I don't care who knows that. And in isolation, it might not be as problematic, but the concern happens when you start aggregating that data with different data sources, or you start sharing that data with entities that are going to make decisions based on that. So you share the number of steps with your employer and they make decisions about your, it seems far-fetched, but they make decisions about whether to promote you because you are more active or less active, not just health insurance and how it could affect that. So I think that's one around data sensitivity, and kind of a somewhat related thing is around just digital literacy and how much information people either think they know or just don't know. And so I think there's a lot of potential for unwittingly sharing sensitive information with these devices. And we don't know how that data is necessarily going to be used both in the immediate future, but also in the far future. And so that raises a lot of concerns for me.
Great, thanks. Yasheng, what comes up in your work?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me here. We have been also doing research in this area, especially in smart home for some time. And one of the approach I took was really look at the multi-stakeholder perspective. So basically not looking only at the users, but also other entities that might be involved in a smart home setting. So that would include people like we call bystanders. Like if you are visiting other people's home, you don't have control of your of whether the device can be used or what device can collect, but your data is being collected. So that's one. There's some other cases like if you share a dorm with your roommates, all those kind of situations. So I guess one of the things that surfaced in my work is really the tension among different stakeholders. So how do you balance the needs of different stakeholders, and how can you negotiate the expectations? And then, one thing that's kind of really interesting is, we have been seeing that bystanders, they not only have privacy needs, but they also want to have some level of control. And how do you do that in a setting of, this is not your home? How do you do that? So that's kind of the thing, being one of my focus.
Great. And then Michael, what did Jessica not talk about?
Yeah, can I just say all of the above? I mean, one of the things I think is really interesting in some of the work and some of our findings is the role of context in people's comfort of how that data flows and who gets access to the data and what kind of inferences might be made about me. Unsurprisingly, many people felt it might be okay, for example, for an insurance company to have access to my Fitbit data because they assume it would help their insurance rates. But of course, if it had the opposite effect, they wouldn't be comfortable with that. So that stands to reason. Another case, though, is that we also had completed this study where we compared attitudes of U.S. citizens and also people living in the Netherlands about their attitudes around data flows and smart devices. And we found some interesting differences in terms of who they trust. And in the U.S., our respondents were more likely to trust the companies and their ability to do good things with my data, and distrust the government. I don't want law enforcement. I don't want the feds to have access to data about my home. But the opposite was largely true with the Dutch respondents, where there was a greater trust in government and that the government was going to do good things or improve lives or efficiencies by having access to the data. But they had a very low trust in institutions like Google, for example, and they're very skeptical of that. So those are some interesting nuances that I think we have to figure out throughout this whole ecosystem.
Great, thanks. Across All four of your comments, I'm really struck by the different types of not only context, but like different types of people that you're talking about. People who are in different roles, different positions of power, people who might be directly or indirectly affected. And I'm wondering if you all can expand a bit on just thinking about, who are the different types of people or groups that are implicated and how might they be implicated differently? We can probably just jump into whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump back in. One of the things that Jessica and I are spending more time thinking about is the work environment, and especially working at home and different types of surveillance and monitoring that takes place in the relationship between an employer and a worker, which automatically has a power disparity. And we're starting to look more closely at how the role of whether it's sensor technology or an IoT device that might be embedded in the workplace, or even in my home, now that there's all kinds of new software that might be tracking what's in the background of my workspace while I'm logging hours, and trying to understand what are workers' understanding and literacies around that, what are their expectations, and also trying to measure, like, again, what's appropriate. When you start messing around with different factors or different types of data that might be collected, at what point do workers start being less comfortable or less understanding about why that might be, that kind of data collection might be happening. So that's one dynamic that we're looking at, but I'll pass the baton.
I think what is coming up here that's very relevant to my work as well is there's a lack or not a clear understanding of what data is being collected and when it's being collected. So in the home environment, individuals in these situations, again, in domestic violence or in family situations, are not clear when the devices are on, what information is being collected about them. And sometimes there are misperceptions, such as the TV, being surveilled through the TV. So it also creates further anxiety and not recognizing, what exactly is collecting what information. And then once these issues become apparent, how to disconnect from them. And, there's just not an equal balance of power. And quickly, the other area that I look at right now is in assisted living facilities and nursing homes, where during the pandemic, when families were cut off from their loved ones, many families in the environments I explored put cameras in the facilities so that they can at least have some understanding of what was going on, and looking at the different challenges around consent and care. And I think that, these are very important issues, and how to manage them creates many issues around privacy contexts.
Yeah. Last summer, we spoke to about 30 people who self-identified as power users. So these were people who had really decked out their homes. They had central hubs. They were using sometimes dozens of devices. Most of them were extremely tech savvy, worked in IT, or had spent the time to become really active. And we had some really interesting conversations with them around how they negotiate use of these devices and making their home a smart home with other people in the household. And very often the partner, the person who was not the person doing all of the purchasing and setup, was not very tech savvy. And some people expressed some tensions between, themselves and their partner about, like, how much can you buy and put in? And, like, a lot of times the partner eventually caved and was like, whatever makes you happy. But, it's hard to say that they necessarily have a full understanding of that. And then the other obvious piece of this is children, who have very little agency or decision-making power in most homes around buying and implementing technology that might be collecting various types of data about them. And we had conversations with people, but I don't think that most people are engaging in any kind of critical reflection on those bystanders. Maybe, Yajing, this is a nice, pass to you in how they think about the other people who are wrapped up in that data collection.
Yeah, so I mean, there's not just how they think of that. One of the things that we have been looking at recently is, in the first step, how do we notify users and other people about the data collection? I think that's kind of captures some of the topics that's flowing around. How do you do that, like, in a way that you can satisfy the needs for being aware of what's going on around you, and at the same time preserving some level of privacy, especially for the users. Because if you think from the data collection, data device control perspective, then all the users, they have more power of in this equation. But if you think of from the notification perspective, then if the bystander is going to say, hey, then I'm demanding some sort of information, or they're using some sort of techniques. For example, there was a platform built by Danny Huang from NYU for the IoT inspector. So if I have some those kind of stuff, I scan your home network. Then in that case, well, I kind of know what's going on in your home as a bystander, but that's an invasion to your privacy as device owner. So that we're trying to explore how what are the ways that we can use to really notify different stakeholders about their about the data practices of surrounding devices, and at the same time we're trying to explore, okay, so how once we know how to do that, can we do that considering different contexts, different social factors. And then we talk about power dynamics, talk about different social norms, different actors. We can say children, or children and parents, or in a temporary smart home like Airbnb, where you have the host and tenants. Then you have the power users and their family members. All these kind of situation will potentially change how you want to notify users, and how different stakeholders can learn about data practices. So that's something come to my mind.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I'm hearing how kind of a range of factors, both around data literacy, around kind of social power relationships, the kind of interpersonal family dynamic relationships, are affecting a whole range of things, from kind of understanding what data is being collected, the ability to consent or not to consent, these kind of like decisions that are made at installation and setup and startup. I'm curious what you think the kind of some of the longer term implications could be, beyond, the in the moment data collection. What are some of the things that could happen, further down the road? I think some things around like data aggregation were hinted at earlier.
I mean, I'll just start off with a really basic example that I love to use, which is Elf on a Shelf, which I'm convinced is normalizing surveillance among young children, so that they're just expecting to be watched in various ways and have data captured about them in various ways. And yes, that might be true to an extent, but do we want to live in a society where people just, are like, that the trope of, privacy is dead, all of that we're always being watched, 1984 comes true. I don't think we do. So, I'm sure lots of parents love Elf on the Shelf, but it is a surveillance tool at its core.
I mean, I think related to that, we have a lot of function creep kind of concerns. And the notion of having a camera on my front porch might create all kinds of efficiencies for me and my household. But suddenly, if I'm plugged into this wider network now of neighborhood surveillance, and just what is that path that we're now walking myself and my neighbors down? And I think those are some of the other consequences, similar to what Dajin's talking about. The bystander effect, I think, is a really serious issue.
Yeah, I definitely want to build on that. So that reminds me of the case where, of Apple in the iOS devices, where they announced last year, the new feature of, they can scan, you can see your text message, you look at their photos to see the child abuse related materials. And then, so I guess the story here is, when we first purchased these devices, we never thought that would be the case. And, Apple has been kind of reassuring their positive image is as being privacy friendly. But at some point, the companies, they do have the power to repurpose the infrastructure for some different purpose. I guess for IoT devices, for smart homes, I think it's kind of dangerous that you are leaving this backdoor. The companies, they would have the power to use these network for surveillance purposes if there's some justification or some other purpose that might in the future. That's something I'm just kind of worried about.
I think in terms of family, and what Jessica was saying, also in terms of youth, we are bringing children up in environments in studying families where there are so many different types of devices that are being used to collect data. And what we're also seeing in the schools now is on many laptops there that are handed to children, there are also different types of software that are monitoring conversations. And there just doesn't seem to be a lot of digital boundaries in people's lives, especially young people. And they're not even aware of what their rights should be. And it's not always clear who's advocating for these rights. And I think that this whole area is very important in terms of what we communicate, teach, and create policies around, because when schools put the software out there to protect children, is the intention, there isn't a lot of notification about it, and a lot of parents and families are not aware. And then bringing the child into the home environment where there are all these devices, again, their consent isn't necessarily brought into the conversation. But I think it's important that we create better education for kids around these types of topics so that they have a sense of what their rights are and how they can think about privacy in terms of safety.
Oh my gosh, I completely blanked on what I was going to say. Oh gosh. I really appreciate what Diana was saying. I know that one of my other projects that's not with Michael is around developing curriculum and educational materials for elementary school children on this topic, because we make the argument that if we're putting phones in children's hands, when they're 2 or 3 years old, it's time to start talking about this and, thinking about how you have these conversations geared toward, different learning stages and things like that is probably the challenge. But most parents don't think you should be talking about that until much older, middle or high school, before you have these conversations. So I completely agree with what Dana said.
Yeah, I also think the kind of school provided device example is a nice discussion, like some of the limits of individual choice, which is usually how we think about privacy in the US. Right? Does family, you might not really be able to opt out of, accepting that device or using that device. And the function creep issue, I think, also points to the way that, these devices are both it's the hardware and the software, right? And then there are things like over-the-air updates. I have some smart cameras that I can play around with at home, and got a push notification the other day to update the firmware so that I could have people tracking detection enabled. I was like, I don't know if I want that, but the devices that get installed in these physical spaces, even if the device is the same and doesn't change, the software capabilities can still change over time. I'd also like to take a moment to remind the audience that we're going to be moving to some Q&A in a little bit, and you should feel free to start populating questions in the little Q&A box. So we started getting to some of these things that we might be able to do, like educational materials. I'm curious what you all see as different opportunities to try to address these different harms and risks.
I think a lot of what we've been hearing are things, again, how to increase literacy and transparency. And that comes from different directions. There's educational pieces. There's whether or not we create some kind of nutritional label around the data. And that's something that came out of the conversations we had with some of our power users. Like, they want to know if I'm buying a smart light bulb, who is it expected to communicate with, and what IP address makes sense and what IP addresses don't make sense. If all of a sudden my light bulb or my TV is sending data to some server that just doesn't seem logical, and they wanted an easy way to know that at the point of purchase, and then maybe even during use. That's something that I think many of us have brainstormed about. How do we create the right kind of in-house display that starts glowing red when I have lots of personal data coming from my kids' bedrooms devices, and creating some kind of way to help people understand what's happening in real time, I think would be a really interesting set of research to engage in.
Yeah, most of my research is around thinking about skills development, but I also acknowledge that that is not going to solve the problem. And to me, the biggest thing that needs to happen is a shift from putting responsibility on the end user to the companies. And so whether this is comprehensive privacy reform in the US, hey, maybe it'll actually happen someday. I'm not going to hold my breath, but if we can, whether we mirror GDPR or whether we create something that works better for the US, holding these companies more accountable to, at minimum, make sure they're including proper security protocols to make these devices less vulnerable, providing nutrition labels or something like that, some kind of standardized template to talk about what data is being collected, not just assuming, oh, well, if the end user spent more time learning about this, well, then they would have taken the steps they needed to properly protect their data. Like, people aren't going to do that. Yes, some will, but we can't have such high expectations for consumers and low expectations for companies.
I agree, and I would just say that also recognizing vulnerable users such as survivors in these domestic violence situations, once they are aware that they're being surveilled, it's very difficult if you're still living in the physical environment where these devices are installed to separate from the devices and still maintain your life. And we've seen this with family plans when survivors have been on shared family plans with phones. And I've worked on the Safe Connections Act and trying to get survivors to easily disconnect from a phone plan where the abuser is in control of the account. And this same scenario now translates into IoT devices in the home. And it's very hard to implement policy in this area because everybody has their own interest. But at the same time, we still need to allow users to separate and give them the tools to do so. And there is a challenge around the digital literacy and understanding of how these devices work. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities to address these issues, but they're very complex in all of these different scenarios.
Yeah, I guess wanted to kind of build up on what Jessica just mentioned about the companies. I guess one of the things is, I guess one of the stakeholder that has not been involved as much in the conversation is like the developers and the manufacturers, how they can. So because for a lot of the developers and the manufacturers, they put privacy as definitely not the top priority. They focused on everything else, and the privacy is always an afterthought. So I guess from that perspective, making it easier for developers to reveal what their data practices, just like what Apple did for the nutrition label, the app privacy label, something like that. Or even have develop some sort of universal privacy framework, just like what we did for the security. We have the OAuth authentication. If there's some similar technology that can be done for example, security cameras, and then things like that would from the beginning make the device more private, rather than put everything on the user's shoulder.
Yeah, I really appreciate the breadth of kind of interventions you all talked about that. I feel like often, especially in human-computer interaction, we focus a lot at that moment of the user interface where people are making decisions, and that's obviously really important. There are things like law and policy, or supporting people in physical spaces, or figuring out ways to support developers and manufacturers. So I really like that breadth. We can jump a little bit into some of the Q&A questions, and I encourage to keep those questions coming from the audience. We have a question here about, could any of you speak to cases where users' perceptions change as their positionalities change? So for example, a user who is really tech savvy and uses a lot of smart home technologies in their own home, might they view it differently if they go to somebody else's home and they're a bystander rather than an owner?
Yeah, I guess I can jump in on that. So one of the things we've been seeing is when we did a study with the users or the owners, their privacy perceptions oftentimes seems to be tend to be static, meaning that once they purchase the device, they have this some sort of expectation or they form their privacy perception. Those things rarely change when they are still the users. But bystanders perception tend to be very dynamic based on the situation they are, based on what context they're in, and that would largely affected by kind of some of the social factors, like you come to my house versus come to your boss house, then you definitely have different expectations in terms of privacy. Even though you don't, even though you have different perceptions, then you might take different measures or choose to take actions or not. So, but the thing is, like anyone can be a bystander, regardless of whether you're a user or not. So, from that perspective, from what we have been seeing in our studies, people's perception do change when they're users versus when they're bystanders. It's just that it's a matter of we can right now we don't have a very clear way to formulate how users' perception will change, because there are a lot of factors that we still don't understand. Right.
Yeah, it makes me, I don't know if we have like longitudinal data on this, but the question makes me think of, I guess people's, life relationships change, have kids, etc. Do their, do those types of life events then also affect how they think about these types of issues? We have a question here about like informing different folks. So given that kind of app developers tend to have a really poor understanding of what data their apps collect and who's it shared with, if they have a poor understanding, how can parents or other stakeholders begin to make informed decisions?
Yeah, I don't think we can expect them to be able to do that, because there's, we always talk about how the technology moves so much faster than our ability to keep up with it, and especially policy's ability to keep up with it. So, busy parents in the middle of a pandemic certainly aren't going to keep up with any of this. I think there are organizations out there that are useful, that are providing vetted information. Common Sense is a really good one for kind of media in general for parents about, children's technology. And if you're trying to say like, oh, well, is this app going to be a good app for my kid to use, or is it going to collect a bunch of data? EFF does this a lot they have, even before Apple's nutrition labels, they did this for a bunch of different industries where they have these nice charts about different types of data that's being collected. So anything like that is useful. It's not necessarily a solution. It's not going to give you all of the information, but it's almost, like people fall back on heuristics in decision making. This helps you kind of overcome maybe that initial, well, this looks like it'll keep my kid busy, so I'll get it. I don't know why I keep using, well, no, I guess the question was about children. One thing that is concerning though, and to go, Yajing mentioned Apple's release of nutrition labels over a year ago. The media reports about a month in started saying, hey, Apple's not vetting these. And we went, and Washington Post went, and we looked at 12 of these, and 11 of them were wrong. So like, if you can't vet this information, much like Apple's pop-up about ask the app not to track my data or collect my data, and they found out that apps didn't have to honor that. What we don't want is for, whether it's resources, tools, other things to help people make decisions, that is just creating this illusion of privacy where people are like, okay, I'm confident because I looked at the nutrition label and everything looks fine, when we don't know that that can be vetted. So I think there's this very fine line between making information available to help with decision making and making sure that that information is something that somebody can trust.
Just speaking a little bit to that question, I do a lot of work with parents and caregivers and educators, and I think the challenges are, what data are the apps collecting, and will my child be safe on the applications? And it's very, I think one would hope that the schools would take part of this on in terms of educating both parents and youth a little bit around these issues in terms of their digital citizenship programs and safety. And I think there is some movement towards that, but it's very challenging for parents today to understand the different features of the applications. And then I find to even focus on what data the apps collect. I don't think that's always the first question on parents' minds, because they don't always, not every parent even knows to ask that question. And although it seems very obvious to us in a lot of my work with in the foster care system or in other high-risk youth environments, I don't think parents think about it that way, first off. And so that's part of the challenge for us to address in the HCI field, and working with the companies and the schools. And, you know, as Jessica mentioned, Common Sense does this and other groups, but there's still a lot to be done.
I think a challenge there too is this movement away from computing devices where I can install ad blockers or other kinds of things to lock down data collection, but it's much harder to do that on my phone and nearly impossible to do that on a smart device, you know, sitting in my house. And so again, the power users that we've interviewed set up firewalls and created all kinds of quite sophisticated means to make sure that their smart devices never actually touch the internet as a way to manage their protection. But again, we can't expect every household to be able to do that. And until we start raising sort of the bar, and I think this is pressure on developers and designers, you know, raising the bar in terms of what's an appropriate level of data collection, and capturing, we're not going to overcome that. I mean, the example that I use constantly in the classroom is, you know, we can buy a Roku TV that fills your entire wall and is $600, and it's that cheap because they're collecting an unbelievable amount of data about everything that you do or even don't do on the TV, because that's data for them as well. And the hardware, it's like the HP printer of today's environment. You know, the hardware is not the product; it's the data and the services that they can attach to it. So I do think we have some work to do to sort of try to shift the way that the market operates.
Yeah, and kind of building on, you know, beyond some of these interventions at the consumer level, we have a question here about educating other stakeholders, for example, local government officials who might be involved in like smart city efforts. And I think, you know, folks have talked about, you know, maybe there are other types of non-consumer stakeholders where educational efforts could be useful too. And so curious how you all think about that.
I like that question a lot, because that is such an interesting kind of target in terms of decision makers in these spaces that may not be technologists themselves. And the corollary that I'll just introduce is I've done some work with some folks in the library space about how do we make sure that librarians, or even more so like library boards, understand what questions to ask when they're buying a new piece of software or a new type of technology within the library, because they want to protect patron privacy. They want to, you know, do these kinds of things, but who knows what's coming along with this new, you know, platform that we're adding to add some functionality. So we created these one-page primers of like, here's what to ask if you're a library trustee and you're now vetting vendors for some kind of system. You know, here are the points and here are the things that you need to worry about, because it's too easy for us to assume everyone's an expert or spends, you know, 12 hours a day thinking about these things like we do. So that might be an approach that we have to think about. What are the right kind of white papers or the right kind of just simple things that any city board member would need to know before they start signing up for Google Labs or something, because the dollars make sense. You know, how do we make sure we get that communication there? So I don't think I have an answer to that question, but I think it's the right thing for us to be thinking about.
Yeah, I kind of reminds me of something a few years ago, 2015, 2016-ish, New York City, they implement this network Bluetooth beacon, you know, the small little device that can be used to, you know, it's not you can argue that it's not a tracking device, you know, different people have different views on that, but, you know, when that thing was, the network was implemented in New York City, then there has been a huge, you know, against voices against that move, because, you know, from the government perspective, they're using Bluetooth beacons to provide a, you know, smart city kind of features. They can use that for navigation to give you a more tailored advertisement, or things like that, the promotions, all those kind of benefits. But at the same time, people are just so concerned about all the potential surveillance and the tracking and all this kind of thing. So I guess the thing there is, but overall, I think the research at the privacy aspect of smart cities and smart infrastructure, IoT as an infrastructure, is still largely lacking. So I guess from that perspective, I think there are a few other efforts out there that can try to learn from the research. For example, the FTC every year they have PrivacyCon. They want to bring in researchers, the research projects from the last year to present there, just to kind of inform what public policies, what the government can do to support these kind of efforts. But at the same time, I think there's still large. There are a lot of things that we can do from the public policy perspective, from the government perspective.
Two quick points. In 2012, Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford came out with a really nice article, 6 provocations for big data. And the provocation that always sticks with me is that bigger data is always better. And we need to encourage people, whether it's city officials, whether it's whoever that is collecting data, that more data does not necessarily mean you're going to be able to build a better product, make better inferences. It's much more complex than that. And I think cities, especially as there's this huge push for smart cities, often fall into that trap. Well, if we only collected more data about our residents, if we only put more sensors in, well, then things would get better. And it needs to be a much more nuanced conversation. I think you can look to the fallout from the City of Toronto Google partnership a couple years ago, in which Ann Cavoukian, the person behind Privacy by Design, had been involved in this project and then eventually said, no, I don't want to be involved with this, because it became very clear that even though Google had kind of made these overtures about they care about data privacy, that in practice, as they started to move forward, that wasn't the case. So especially when we're thinking about smart cities or these larger scale implementations of data, it becomes really challenging. And these people need to bring in experts into these conversations to have kind of more nuanced discussions about what data to collect and how to treat that data, and whether to be transparent or make data accessible, and all of these other questions.
Yeah, the city example I think is really fascinating, because there's the goals to which these systems are put in place are things that I think people tend to agree with, around like better quality of life, or security, or other issues. But I think there's that nuanced conversation about, like, are these systems the right way? Are we assuming that there's that more data is going to equal better outcomes? And I think sometimes sets off a kind of false dichotomy between privacy and these other values, when you assume that these are the technologies that will get us there. There's a question about the kind of types of data that are being collected from different devices, and do different types of data represent different types of concerns? I think I would also add my provocation of, when are the risks and harms not about data, but about other things related to the deployment of these devices?
Well, one of the things that Jessica and I have been focusing a lot on is trying to understand how different types of data rise to different levels of concern, also depending on the context, on who has access to that data, on the purpose that is being used, and trying to approach that. We use the lens of contextual integrity, a theory from Helen Nissenbaum, to help sort of unpack some of those complications. And that gives us, from a research perspective, a more nuanced view of how users think about things. And I think that's, to me, that's kind of like the important background of this kind of question, is that we just can't treat data as a static category. Even just health data as a category doesn't come close to reflecting the complexities of what might fall into that bucket, let alone under what circumstances am I okay or not okay with that being shared or collected. And I guess that's what makes this so hard, is so if I'm trying to give advice to Apple or a designer in terms of how they should collect data or handle it or treat it, it becomes really challenging because we're pushing against this idea that there's a simple solution, because not all size does not fit. I mean, one size does not fit all, a kind of approach. So I think that's an interesting challenge for us as a research and design community on how to address and deal with that complexity. But I'm hoping that maybe Yashin or Diana or Jessica will have an answer.
I think this is a very challenging question, but to think of and an important question. So thinking of the health and genetic data component and how we should I think about it in terms of the vulnerable users and when you have a choice to engage with these systems, right? And so having looked a little bit at health and genetic data, I think the issue there is that a lot of times when people have to make specific decisions to engage with the healthcare system, it's because they have a health issue that requires them to get genetic testing or make health decisions. And at that point in time, it's not always clear to them which company is doing the genetic testing and where that information goes. But it's equally important for that person to have their genetic profile to make a health decision about chemotherapy or about their risks if they do or don't use a certain treatment. And I think that that's a whole other area where consumers / patients don't necessarily understand. And it appears to the patient that it's just the hospital collecting the information. And it's not clear that it's going out to another company that then can use that data in different ways. And, and considering there's a lot of screening now for psychiatric medications and companies surfacing in that area as well, I think that there is a lot of understanding that we all need to have in terms of what companies should be allowed to do with that information.
Yeah, I kind of build on both of you were just mentioned. I guess I completely agree that this is definitely something very complicated, and it's not just about data types, not just about data collection. We need to think about the context, think about the the purpose of the data collection, who can access the data, all those kind of factors could potentially impact how people think about this. I guess that kind of goes back to one of the things we talked about before, is about informed decisions, and then going back to the transparency. I guess one of the things is one of the things that the privacy community has been trying to do is how to increase users' awareness of this data practices, and that can help users to make informed decision. Because the notion of informed decision really comes down to each individual, what are the type of data that seems to be most important to you? What are the things that you really want to protect from anything, or protect from some other stakeholders. So going back to what Jessica just mentioned about the illusion that some of the in some of these kind of systems like Apple give you the notion of hey, ask the developer not to ask the app not to track, or whatever the term is. So I guess in that case, user, I think even before that, do users really know, are they asking Apple to stop this, or are they asking the app developer to stop this? And then when they look at the privacy label in the App Store, are those labels provided by Apple or provided by the app developer? So if they, for example, if they have a clear information or clear knowledge of that, they might think about the data collection in a different way, and they might make different decisions. They might choose to turn off their location tracking. So just based on who actually collects the information. So it's very complicated.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question. And this comes back to that bystander issue around what's a reasonable or functional way to notify bystanders that they're being tracked or watched. And she gives the example of Apple's AirTags or Tile, which has like chips or chirps or notifications, which are often missed by users or can even be suppressed by abusers? And are there better ways to think about this?
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit on that. The short answer is I don't know. I don't have a good idea. So in our most recent paper, we had a paper this year at CHI, where we explored 4 different types of notification mechanism for users and bystanders. So that we include things like a privacy dashboard where you can see all the information, a smartphone app where you can check out the information and receive notification. We include a privacy speaker, kind of which is inspired by Amazon Echo, where when you receive the delivery package, you're gonna speak up, hey, you have a package delivered, and then we're thinking, oh, if there any data being collected, can we do that? And we also have a mechanism which is ambient light, so they can change the color based on the amount of data being collected and then the data collection status. So we're doing the research on that and see what bystander user would like to use in different situations, and what are the things that you feel like work and don't work for each of this. And then we found that people really like to use smartphone notifications. They want to receive notifications for users and bystanders, but we also find that there are situations where some of these work better than others. For example, the ambient light could be useful if people have a universal understanding of what a red light means versus what a green light means, and then that can really provide a type of unobtrusive notification of what's going on here. And then if you are in a situation where you see the light suddenly turn to green or turn to red, you kind of have an idea what's going on there. So, but there are a lot of usability issues in there. We're still trying to address all those things. So at this point, what I guess one of the things we're trying to look into is a multimodal notification. So taking all these factors into consideration, thinking about the potential rules and potential social factors and potential context, how can we really effectively notify different stakeholders, including bystanders? We're still working on that. So at this point, I don't really have a good answer to that, but that's definitely one of the areas that's interesting. I don't know whether others have any other opinions.
Yeah, I do get concerned about possible abuse of those kinds of notifications. I was just seeing a thread on Twitter about Meta and their Horizons Metaverse, and whether or not they should have notification if someone enters that 4-foot personal safety bubble or whatever it is that they're calling it. But how that could be abused, that a harasser could be constantly notifying you by showing, look at how much I'm interfering with your life or how much I'm tracking you. And so it'd be cautious to think really hard about how to make those things work.
I think that given the digital literacy of the different vulnerable users that might have these trackers or tiles covertly placed in their physical devices to surveil them, the idea of having multiple notifications that the user can then regulate and choose, maybe it's text message for another, maybe it's email message. So I think that there's a couple of different considerations. I don't think we know the exact answer yet, but making sure that people are alerted properly. Clearly a chirpy noise that people might not hear is not good enough if your safety is at risk. So I think giving the user or the person being surveilled control over, well, these are the initial ways I've been contacted. Now, how do I want to be contacted going forward can be another option, because everything's not going to work for the same person. And then also, let's say everybody should be notified by email, some people's emails might be compromised in tech abuse, or messaging might not be safe, and the phone itself might not be the safe alert system to use for certain people. So I think that we need to understand these issues a little bit better, but the answer is probably many different ways in terms of notification, but it's a very important question.
Great. So We like to end these CLTC talks with kind of a quick lightning round question at the end, which is just, what do you think would be the single most impactful change that could be done in this space based on your research, whether that's policy, design, company practices, or something else?
Comprehensive privacy reform. Federal regulations.
Can I say burn it all down? Or is that is that too nihilistic?
We all just go live in the middle of nowhere with no technology.
Yeah, I think getting designers, especially platforms, to recognize the diversity of users and data, and that we need to think more about the complexity of these relationships.
Also, education of the users, the next generation, the app developers, companies, city government. That would be big.
I mean, I would agree again, like designing for vulnerable users, policy, education, all of these are areas that we need to pursue going forward as these devices become ubiquitous.
Great. Well, Michael, Jessica, Yashing, Diana, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation this past hour. And thank you to the audience for all your great questions. And I will turn it back over to Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much, Richmond. And yes, a big thank you once again to our great panelists. That was a fascinating conversation, a jam-packed hour. I also want to quickly acknowledge our various CLTC supporters, our network of community partners and foundations, as well as our industry partners who support, help us make events like this possible. Again, thank you to everyone so much in the audience for your participation and your attention, your great questions today. We would love for you to stay in touch. And here we have a few ways that you can do so. We've got information for CLTC and our co-sponsor for today's Cyversity, as well as our panelists who have graciously provided their Twitter handles and email addresses where you're welcome to follow up or contact them directly. And yeah, we hope that you give us a follow on Twitter or head to the CLTC website where you can sign up for our newsletter. And that way you won't miss future events and announcements from CLTC. I will leave this slide up here for a minute just in case folks want to jot down some information. But again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Richmond, for being our fearless leader throughout this discussion. And again, to the audience for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Till then, take care.